You're 25. You've done everything right. The degree, the internships, the job, and yet, you're already exhausted in a way your parents didn't feel until their 40s. This isn't laziness. It isn't weakness. Something fundamental has shifted in the architecture of work itself, and the numbers tell a story nobody expected. The average American reaches peak burnout at 42, but Gen Z, they're hitting that same wall at 25. That's a 17-year acceleration in a single generation. 74% of Gen Z workers report burnout. Among baby boomers, just 38%. We're not talking about a slight uptick. This is a complete inversion. So what happened? What changed between their generation and ours that's causing this kind of collapse? 17 years earlier. Well, let's start with what burnout actually is. The World Health Organization defines it across 3 dimensions: emotional exhaustion, cynicism about work, and a feeling that nothing you do actually matters. That third one hits different for Gen Z. Reduced personal accomplishment. The sense that despite years of effort, the reward never comes. That the promise was a lie. In psychology, there's something called the job demands resources theory. Burnout happens when the demands placed on you outweigh the resources available to meet them. For previous generations, the equation balanced differently. You worked hard, yes, but there were resources on the other side. Job security, pensions, affordable housing, a clear path forward. The social contract was simple: pay your dues now, reap the rewards later. And for the most part, it worked. People could see the horizon they were walking toward. For Gen Z, that horizon has disappeared into fog. The demands have multiplied. The resources have evaporated. And no one told them the rules had changed. Here's the first pressure point: money. Gen Z pays an average of $526 per month towards student loans. That's nearly double the overall average of $284. $526 every single month, before rent, before groceries. Before you've even started living your life, a quarter of your paycheck is already spoken for. And that debt doesn't just affect your bank account. Researchers found that student loan burdens create immediate pressure to excel and earn, leaving almost no room for the career exploration previous generations enjoyed. In 2024, 30% of Gen Z reported feeling financially insecure. 1 year later, that number jumped to 48%, a 60% increase in 12 months. But financial pressure alone doesn't explain everything, because here's the thing: every generation has faced economic challenges, recessions, inflation, market crashes. What makes this different? What's different is the device in your pocket, the one that's probably within arm's reach right now, the one that has fundamentally altered how young brains process stress. Researchers have a term for what happens when you endlessly scroll through negative content, doomscrolling. And it's not just a bad habit, it physically alters brain structures. Here's what the neuroscience shows: chronic doomscrolling weakens the prefrontal cortex. That's impulse control. It keeps the amygdala hyper-alert. That's your anxiety center. And it impairs the hippocampus, memory, and emotional regulation. The mechanism is dopamine. Every time you discover new information, even negative information, your brain releases a small hit. And tolerance builds fast, requiring more engagement for the same response. More than half of Gen Z say social media negatively impacts their mental health. They know it's harming them. And they keep scrolling anyway, because that's what dopamine-driven behavior loops do. In 2025, BrainRot was named Oxford's Word of the Year. It's the term Gen Z uses to describe what constant digital consumption does to their minds, and the science backs them up. But there's a third factor we haven't discussed yet, and it might be the most insidious of all, because it touches on something fundamental to human motivation: hope. The belief that your efforts will lead somewhere, that the sacrifices you're making today will pay off tomorrow. For previous generations, that hope was a load-bearing wall. Management expert Susie Welch put it plainly: older generations worked just as hard, but they had hope. They could see the connection between effort and outcome. Gen Z often cannot. When you can work for years and still not afford a home, when you can do everything right and still feel behind, something breaks in the motivational system. Burnout isn't just about being tired. It's about losing the belief that your exhaustion is temporary, that there's light at the end of the tunnel. When that belief goes, so does your capacity to keep pushing. And then there's the pandemic. Many Gen Z workers entered the workforce during and after COVID, a time of profound upheaval, social isolation, and constantly changing expectations. They missed mentorship. They missed in-person socialization. They missed watching how careers actually unfold in real time. They got Zoom calls instead. In 2023, the U.S. Surgeon General declared loneliness a public health epidemic, equivalent to smoking 15 cigarettes daily, and Gen Z entered adulthood right in the middle of it. So let's put it all together. 98% of 18 to 24-year-olds report at least one symptom of burnout. 98%, nearly everyone. This isn't a subset of struggling individuals. This is a population-level phenomenon. When nearly an entire age group shows symptoms, we're not looking at personal failure. We're looking at structural collapse. The business impact is measurable. Employees experiencing burnout are 63% more likely to take a sick day. Teams with high burnout show 18 to 20% lower productivity. And here's where it gets even more complicated. There's an ongoing debate about whether this represents genuine structural disadvantage, or whether Gen Z simply has lower resilience than previous generations. Some argue every generation faced challenges, that Gen Z needs to toughen up. But others counter with objective data: housing costs relative to wages, climate anxiety, digital saturation. These conditions are measurably different. The truth probably lives in uncomfortable middle ground. Yes, objective conditions have worsened. And yes, constant digital connectivity may have altered how young people process and regulate stress. By April 2026, 1 in 4 Gen Z workers had abandoned traditional desk jobs for trade careers, specifically citing burnout concerns. They're not quitting work. They're quitting a broken system. Which raises an interesting question. Is Gen Z's burnout a dysfunction to be treated, or a rational response to conditions that genuinely are worse? Maybe it's not a bug. Maybe it's a feature. So what do you do with all of this? If you're experiencing burnout, the first step might be understanding that what you're feeling isn't personal failure. It's a population-level phenomenon. Individual solutions have limits when the problem is structural. You can optimize your morning routine all you want, but if the fundamental equation is broken, personal hacks won't fix it. That said, there's still value in identifying your primary stressor. Financial pressure and digital overwhelm require different interventions. They feel similar, but they're not the same problem. If your stress is primarily financial, consider that practical solutions, side income, debt restructuring, geographic arbitrage, may help more than meditation apps. Money problems need money solutions. If your stress is primarily digital, research suggests that treating your phone like a mind-altering substance might help, because neurologically speaking, that's what it is. Set boundaries accordingly. Remember what the research showed. Doomscrolling physically changes brain structure. It weakens impulse control, amplifies anxiety, and impairs emotional regulation. This isn't metaphor. This is neurology. And here's the harder question. Consider whether the traditional career path, pay your dues now, reap rewards later, still applies to your situation. That social contract may have expired. Evaluate whether your current sacrifice is actually building toward outcomes you value, not the outcomes you were told to value, not what looks good on paper. What actually matters to you? If you're finding this conversation helpful, consider subscribing. We explore psychology research like this every week, and understanding the forces shaping your mind is the first step to navigating them. Because here's what the burnout research ultimately shows: awareness matters. Understanding that you're responding to structural conditions, not personal inadequacy, changes how you approach the problem. You can't individually fix an economic system. But you can stop blaming yourself for responding rationally to irrational conditions. That's not giving up, that's clarity. 82% of all employees are now at risk of burnout. This isn't just a Gen Z problem anymore, it's spreading upward through the entire workforce. The conditions that burned out Gen Z at 25 are now affecting millennials in their 30s, and increasingly Gen X in their 40s. The tsunami is moving through the generations, which means this isn't really a story about one generation's weakness. It's a story about what happens when the fundamental structures of work start to fail everyone. Gen Z hit peak exhaustion at 25, not because they're weaker than their parents, but because the equation has fundamentally changed. More debt, less security, infinite digital demands, vanishing hope, 17 years earlier than previous generations. That's not personal failure. That's a canary in a coal mine, warning us that the mine itself is filling with gas. The question now isn't how to fix Gen Z. It's how to fix the conditions that are breaking everyone, because the curve is bending toward all of us. And the clock is running out. That's the psychology of burnout at 25. Understanding the forces doesn't automatically solve them, but it's the beginning of knowing what we're actually fighting against.